to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Darren, ExoAcademian. This is the last show of 2022. We hope that wherever you may be, you're having a wonderful end of the year and are looking forward to a happy and healthy 2023. Darren, as is often the case, when you get to the end of a year, you start looking back and taking stock of what happened in the last 12 months, and then also you look ahead to what might be coming down the road, and I think we're going to do a little bit of that on this show. It's going to be a little bit of a free form, maybe more so than what we normally do, but I think we're going to have a good time with it. But how you been, and what are you looking forward to?
Well, I mean, I've been good, but it's been, when I reflect on this year, there's been more change this past year, than almost any year in my life, I think. And there's been previous years where I've said that, but I really think that's true this year. Almost nothing that was the case when the year began is the case anymore in a lot of ways. So that is kind of discombobulating, to use a point of convergence favorite term. But at the same time, I feel like I'm slowly getting more accustomed to being familiar and comfortable with change. I like this expression, learning to become comfortable with uncomfortability is helpful. And like we talked about in the last episode, when you can go through life without too much attachment to certain preferences, you just reduce your own suffering. So I feel like I'm slowly getting better at just rolling with it when change happens. So been a massively impacting year, so many changes, and I can't imagine that 2023 will have quite the same. But we'll see what happens. But I'm definitely looking forward to it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been a wild year for our show. I want to say that. For folks who haven't been with us from the beginning, we kind of had some planning sessions about 12 months ago, and started the show in early 2022. And it's been an interesting journey there, not only with where the show has gone, but I'm reflecting back too on the many, many times that we have met in person, and what you've been sharing with me, and kind of plans that you had for the year that changed direction a couple of times. It feels like class has been in session, for me anyway. I've had to learn a lot. I've had to put a lot of things into practice. I'm finding that the more that we talk about this topic, the more that we get deeper into, I think, what really matters at the heart of this issue, the more that confronts me with parts of my own life that I need to re-examine. It reframes the way that I approach situations, not only in the UFO community, but also just interpersonally. And, I'm very grateful for that change. It's not come without, some level of discomfort. There are definitely moments where I don't think I get it right, or I have to, kind of change direction. But I have found that at least for me personally, I've got some new tools in my toolkit to be able to approach things that are happening in the world, and that has made me a better person. So I'm grateful for that, and I hope that some of our listeners have been able to kind of take away some things from our show that have deepened their relationship with this journey, that have given them some new questions, that have, hopefully maybe catalyzed some conversation and started them on some new journeys. And I know we've got some exciting journeys ahead as well. I mean, there are inevitably going to be some pretty big revelations that are coming down the pipeline, some of which we can speculate on in the show today, some of which will probably be all surprised to hear. And that will be a, kind of a fun part of the journey as well. So, with all that being said, I mean, what's something that you might want to start with on our show today? What would you like to kind of tackle? Maybe it's something we've talked about before, but kind of revisiting.
Well, before we go there, I just want to say, in light of what you just shared, that I think that's a really important point, that we didn't design this show. Not that we really spent, months and months planning it, but when we planned it, I think we're both wired in such a way that we just want to grow, right? Like, it's just a natural inclination. And so what I would say to people is, if you're, if this different show is your cup of tea, where it's kind of more like UFOtainment, and it's just sort of like, the same stuff year after year after year, I understand that can occupy people's time and kind of tickle their fancy. But I think the way you and I are wired is to grow and to take in information and try to do something with it. Like, well, how does it change our perspective? And the show is a natural, is the fruit of that in many ways. So it's not like we plan, hey, halfway through the year, let's go more spiritual, or something like that.
Right.
It's just kind of what happened because that's what's going on in our lives. So that part's exciting, because I would say that equally the case that we don't really know what 2023 is going to bring, because we certainly couldn't have predicted 2022. In terms of what we can begin on, I think, just before we went on the air, we were talking about, on Theory of Everything, Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp were talking just about some of the things coming down the pipeline. And even though, it's stuff that you and I and people, intimately familiar with this topic have heard before, I still think sometimes when you hear it with fresh ears and you just say, if my aunt heard this, or my cousin, or, my coworker heard this, what would it do? Like, that we're actually using these kind of words, and I'll get to it in a minute, but I was just thinking how George Knapp talked about breaking this story with Bob Lazar back in the day, right? And how people just, even within ufology, thought it was crazy, this notion that someone would be employed by the federal government or some branch of the military or some private contractor on contract with the military to try to figure out some off-planet vehicle that had been recovered, right? And yet that's exactly what's on the table. And in the conversation today, George Knapp talked about not only the idea of whistleblowers going before the congressional committee and giving testimony, but that already some of the shift in focus and some of the mechanisms that have been put in place with the language and whatnot, with the task force, have allowed them to actually figure out where the hardware is what Jeremy actually said, that they've actually not, it's no longer just a hypothetical, right? That maybe somewhere in some deep, facility somewhere, but they're saying they've actually located it. And I assume they mean the congressional members that are involved have actually received intel about where some of this stuff is. And then he went on to say also, like, there's this expression we use, where the bodies are hidden, right? And in this case, it's literally like gray alien bodies or something like that. Or is it future humans? These are the kind of the questions we have that we can maybe sort of start there. So what do you think?
Yeah, that's a good jumping off point, because in many respects, we're talking about two figures there who have been responsible in some large part to where we are now, and the stories that they have told that in George with Bob Lazar, and of course Skinwalker Ranch, and his many decades of reporting on this topic, and Jeremy with his documentaries and kind of more of his activism, that kind of allows us to revisit some of the core components of this issue, right? So, and I think it's the on ramp for those who is to think of it this way, right? There are going to be people, as there always are, right? I have to remind myself of this too, because I'm kind of so into this topic so often every day that I kind of forget that there are people coming on board every week. Like, there are people who are coming new, they're brand new to the topic, they just stumbled across whatever, and they're insatiable, they can't get enough, and they're starting with generally, maybe these ETs are here, maybe their craft have been here, maybe Roswell was real, they're starting with these things. And so I'm remind myself that that's happening, and that's going to happen again. If we get the kind of things that we're hearing from George and Jeremy, if we're going to see that stuff come to fruition, then we're going to have a whole bunch of new folks that are going to be interested in this in ways that we haven't seen before, particularly if we can get some hard, juicy, substantial reporting from Congress on their own interest and traction with this topic. So, for me, I think it might be good to kind of take a look at what were some of the core claims of early ufology, and what what parts of those claims do you hold to be still significantly true and meaningful now? And what ways and what are the ways in which you look at those kind of core claims differently than you may have looked at them from when you started on this journey? So, one we could take a look at might just be, they're here, right? So there was a purported crash that took place in the 40s, the most notable being Roswell. Of course, we've certainly heard of others that have predated that, that there were bodies recovered. And the prevailing hypothesis was, these were beings from another planet, not from Earth, right? And the government squirreled away that material and those bodies and have been studying it, trying to figure out whatever it happens to be. And also that spawned the conspiracy of secrecy, right? The keeping a tight lid on this topic. Some have said more secret than the bomb, the H-bomb. So we can start there. And, what do you think about that now? And what did you, well, let's start with what you thought about it, initially, and what do you think about it now?
Well, it's interesting kind of turning the tables here, because last time we talked about the difference between experiencer kind of concerns versus, the general public. And so we're kind of steering back towards the left here and saying, let's talk about the public conversation and how that's changed over time. So going back to the beginning, I was reading a book by Stanton Friedman recently, and just sort of retracing his steps in the 20th century, trying to figure out what's going on, what kind of groups are studying this. Is Majestic 12 a real thing? Things like that, right? And more recently, James Iandoli, our friend, was talking with George Knapp about whether Zodiac is a real thing, right? Is that an organization? Is that a code word for a loosely organized group? We hear about groups like the Collins Elite, which is also, or the Invisible College, all these sort of infamous groups, right? Studying this topic sort of behind the scenes because, like you say, it was so carefully guarded, and I think actually, unless I'm mistaken, the name of that book that I was reading is actually called Above Top Secret, referring to what you were saying with the H-bomb, right? And I think that kind of paints the picture for people, right? It helps frame it that we know how top secret the H-bomb development was, right? That in many ways, the powers that be felt like the future of civilization. It was a clash of civilizations, right? The Soviet powers and the Westerns, and to imagine that something was on a higher degree than that, right, is pretty interesting, which of course begs the question, what was the nature of the revelations that required it to be at such a high level of secrecy, right? I've heard some people suggest, and I can come across either way this way, suggest that if it was just space aliens, they don't think it would, involve this much secrecy. And that's why there's been this question around, could it be the DNA link that we talked about last time? Is that the part that people just felt like there's no way the general public can handle that, But I know for me, like we've talked many times about this, and when we, again, think about reflecting over the last year, I think both of us, since we first got into this topic, have moved more towards conspiracy thinking. And I don't mean in terms of just crazy schemes that are not supported by evidence, but actually the contrary, that when you actually start digging, you find things that are kind of contrary to what you would prefer to believe. No one wants to believe that their government could be this deceitful and have this level of false narrative being presented to the public. And yet that's kind of where you land. So I think for me, that's been the biggest shift is that I started down a rabbit hole, but how deep I went and how many side tunnels that opened up, I was really not prepared for.
Yeah, that's perhaps a cautionary tale in some ways, right? So I think, keep in mind, there's no roadmap here. There's no, coursework syllabus we can give you that is going to take you on the right, quote unquote, path of discovery here. And also recognizing that your connection to this topic is very much situated in who you are, So if you've had an actual experience, if you have a friend who's had an experience and you believe them, that changes the way that you approach this. If you haven't had an experience, and yet you find some of the witness testimony, the evidence that we've seen from various places, if you find that compelling, then you're coming at it from a very different angle, and you're, maybe looking at it from a national security perspective or looking at it from a technology perspective. So there are all these different frameworks from which you might be connecting with the subject, and it can be kind of jarring. In my opinion, the most jarring journey probably comes from that on-ramp as opposed to the experiencer one, although that has its own, sort of extreme discombobulating effect, right? So, but if you come at it from a nuts and bolts angle, like I think many of us do, and you really kind of dig into it, you can kind of find yourself at the end, or where you are right now, looking back and go, wow, like I'm not even sure what feels solid anymore on the ground that I'm standing on. And so that can be a big challenge. So I say that to say, just, if you're coming at this from a fresh, brand new person perspective, take your time, don't jump to quick conclusions, read as much as you can, weigh all of the different anecdotes and evidence that you can, and try to hold that at arm's length, examine it, looking at it from a variety of perspectives, and then kind of see what, percolates to the top there. I think that will be the best way to assimilate the content.
Yeah, and I was thinking a couple things before I forget, because something occurred to me when you were saying this. Number one, in terms of, you said this thing about, sorry, there's no syllabus we can give you, right? Not only that, but I've actually had people write me and say, hey, you seem to have come to some fairly strong conclusions. Can you tell me exactly like the 9 books I need to read, the 3 YouTube videos I need to watch, and the 2 podcasts I need to listen to get to that same place, right? You can't do it. Right. And I would say that, number one, where I've landed is piecing together all sorts of different information, right? Is number one, that I don't even keep track of it. It's a little bit here or there. You get a little nugget over here, something else over here that corroborates that kind of thing. Okay. On top of that, 2 different people or 3 different people could be exposed to the exact same material and come to different conclusions. That's part of the enigma of this topic, is that your own consciousness comes into play. There's this expression that says, when you start taking note of the phenomenon starts taking note of you, right? And another way to look at that is that you can't help but have your consciousness be one of the factors, one of the variables in play here. And this is one of the ongoing challenges when it comes to a species trying to understand itself, or understand a cosmos of which they are a part, and entangled in a way that you can't really separate us from the cosmos we're in, right? So how do you, quote unquote, objectively study that, right? And so 2 different people will come to different conclusions because their own consciousness is the X factor, right? Because the rest lines up. And I think one thing that would be interesting for us to get into amidst these different topics that we'll take on one by one is to reckon with the fact that, and you kind of hinted at it there, where it starts here, but by the end of the day, everything is in play. Reality, life, death, the nature of existence, what is physicality, right? All these things, a material world versus an idealistic world. You and I, before we went on the air, talked about this, how we've been persuaded towards this idealistic kind of persuasion, perspective on reality. And we've seen how difficult it is for people to really take that step and really grasp what that means, how far it goes. So we'll have people that will talk about some manifestations of the phenomenon being kind of a virtual reality, right? But they feel very confident that everything else, though, is solid and safe, right? And what we're saying is that actually the whole thing, there's no use talking about aspects that are virtual, because the entire thing is, to some degree, it's like I keep saying, a shared dreamscape or a mind space that's kind of held together, and its cohesion that makes you and I see the same sun supposedly every day is because it's mind at large that sort of holds this dream in place, and we are characters within it, embedded within it, so we can't separate ourselves from the dream. Right. But because it's a dream, it has some malleable elements. And this is where some of these others seem to understand this. And that's why I remember saying to you sort of halfway through 2022, I kind of had this revelation around this notion of intermentation, right? This idea that it's more like these different processes of mentation or fields of mentation. And we exist within one that feels solid and coherent, right? Just like this, I've got my laptop sitting on this island here in the kitchen, and it feels really solid. You know, it's kind of granite, right? That's about as solid as you can get, other than diamond maybe. But even physics tells us this is mostly empty space with a few, atomic components within it, and then basically a field which gives it its coherence and its appearance and its, aspect of physicality. But it's completely relative, virtual in many ways, you could say. So that's what's so fascinating about this topic is you can't, I think, honestly go in and really dig and not end up in these places.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's kind of a resonance to not just objects, as you just pointed out there. There's a resonance to our experience of reality. And there's a separate kind of resonance to other experiences of reality that we may not have direct, or our experience of that is very indirect. And so when you have these kind of think of them as resonant frequencies, if you cross the streams, right? If they kind of bump up against each other, there is a little bit of an interference pattern that may occur there, and that interference pattern can present itself in both our resonant reality and whatever the other resonant reality is as different types of phenomena. But macroscopically, it's those two different kinds. I'm just using two kind of a binary example. Those two resonances exist within a grander resonant field of mentation, as you pointed out. And so looking at it from that perspective, at least from my standpoint, has been extremely helpful in approaching this topic. And I also recognize that we just kind of distilled in that little back and forth, like a pretty big kind of different leap and jump than where most people land, when they're studying this from the first time. So maybe if I can rewind just a little bit, going back to these non-human intelligences. So let's just start with that. That there may in fact be some entities other than human, and the prevailing initial hypothesis there was that they were extraterrestrial. Of course, you and I know that that isn't the only hypothesis. There are other hypotheses: interdimensional, ultra-terrestrial, crypto-terrestrial, extraterrestrial. A lot of different typologies here, and they could all be on the table, right? So I think that's what's also quite
don't forget intermentational.
Intermentational, so it can be quite confabulating, you can, to me, like whatever hypothesis you're most drawn towards, it is a mirror of the way in which you look at the world around you, right? So let's just take the easiest one, I think, the extraterrestrial one. Why was that such a compelling hypothesis? Well, it was the dawn of the space race. It was our science was kind of just starting to do some pretty amazing things, and we realized that, here we were, planet Earth, and there were all these other planets out there, and there's life here. Maybe there's life on Venus. Maybe there's life on Mars. Like these were the, kind of the low-hanging fruit of the cosmologies of that given day, and that's why those theories became the most prevalent. If you go back in time, we talked about this a little bit, and I don't know we'll dwell on it too much, but if you go back in time centuries before the humans had sort of this deeper understanding of our place in the solar system, these entities would have been viewed from a kind of a more metaphysical perspective, demonic or angelic, or, certainly not human, but interacting with humans and kind of messing with us in certain ways, sometimes for our benefit, sometimes not for our benefit. And we're all part of a larger game that is involved with kind of a war between these competing factions and, God and Satan and all this kind of stuff. So, whatever you feel most drawn to me, and is a good mirror to how you see the world. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think we should really stress this for people, that what we're saying is it's not that the data necessarily changed. It's that the interpretive framework in which that data was consumed changed, right? Which tells you a lot. So in, medieval times, they would have maybe seen them as fairies or something like that. These, cave-dwelling beings that could, sometimes disappear into the, netherworld or something like that. Is it that there's so much difference in the actual criteria of the events? Not really. I mean, that's kind of what Jacques Vallée pointed out, is that when you, in Passport to Magonia, that when you actually break down the surface veneer, which often is an interpretive layer, the raw experience is remarkably similar. You have missing time, and people disappearing and then reappearing, some people never being returned, experiences where perception and consciousness seems to be manipulated by these others, right? And like you hinted at, in yesteryear, that was interpreted as like spiritual powers, right? Whereas now we would say, well, these ETs have some sort of like really advanced technology that can impact consciousness, but we're trying to parse it from a physicalist point of view, right? So this is really important to point out that, again, it's not so much that the data is different, it's that the models that consume that data and try to make sense of it are different. Another thing I would say is, a little bit surprisingly, I would say, even some of the people pushing for disclosure. So take Chris Mellon as an example. He's been more open recently, saying, he was more coy last year and the year before, right? But he's becoming more outward in terms of saying the ET hypothesis fits the data. That's probably better than anything else right now, or as good as anything else. And that's interesting because I think a lot of us in this community earlier in the year and back in 2021, we're talking about ultra-terrestrials a lot, right? And
Yeah.
And so we were kind of, familiar with this notion that maybe ET was not the best fit for the data, kind of like Jacques Vallée and John Keel came to those conclusions. So then you ask yourself, and this is what I try to encourage people to do, right? When you hear someone like Chris Mellon making a statement like that, don't just say this guy had a high-ranking position in the U.S. military, so he must know what he's talking about. He may, but don't assume that. What I would say is step back and ask yourself, is it his level of consciousness? Is it his biases that make him say ET is the best option? Is ET better than the ultra-terrestrial, for instance? It may be better than a terrestrial conventional power, right? Like the Russians or the Chinese or Iran or something. But is it better than ultra-terrestrial or interdimensional? And how would he know that, right? I would posit to you that it's not a better fit, but he actually just prefers, like you began this conversation, he kind of leans towards ET because it makes sense to him. He can grapple with that one. It exists within his worldview. So for his worldview, that's the most obvious fit. But that's a good example that just because it's the best fit for him doesn't mean it's ultimately the right answer.
Yeah. To kind of take that point a little further too, it's, how could it not change, right? So if we had a time machine right now, we could go into the future 1,000 years, and just, well, let's kind of take, ETs out of the equation, but let's look at future humanity and our understanding of reality in 1,000 years, right? It's not going to look anything like our understanding of reality today. The people of 1,000 years from now will read about today and they'll think, wow, look how much they got wrong. They thought this unbelievable, right? So that to me is, I view that as a core fact of reality, of experience, that it's shifting, it's changing, that it's conditioned, that it's contextual. Like these are things that are just part and parcel of living and having a spatial temporal experience. And when I acknowledge that and am honest with that truth, I can't help but play that exercise and play it backwards and forwards, and then come out of that exercise going, wow, what do we really know? What can we really say definitively? What can we say ontologically about what this happens to be? And I think that's a lot of what you and I have really tried hard to wrestle with here, is that our our taxonomy, like our attempts at labeling whatever this is, like they always kind of fall short to some degree, and they always will, because as new information enters the equation, we have to take that into account and reframe what our understanding of it happens to be. As part of that exercise as well, and we've talked about this a ton, lies sort of the root of understanding, the root of experience, and that is our conscious awareness, right? So if we're kind of coming down into first principles, conscious awareness for you and I has become this kind of lodestar, it's helping us understand and approach every facet of the data, because at the end of the day, that is the most solid ground we feel that we can stand on, is saying we have experience, we are conscious of having experience, and that colors everything else. So I don't know if you want to kind of expound a little bit on that, but to me, like that's the that's the whole enchilada in a way, kind of thinking about it from that perspective. And it definitely allows you to go from this ET conclusion to something else entirely, but also not to exclude it either. And I think that's something that you might like to harp on quite a bit.
Yeah, so I think what we can maybe sort of toggle back and forth a little bit tonight is between, again, just, reckoning with what's on the table in terms of public disclosure and how that might be received and what kind of things might include, but also talk about, the much deeper level, what we think is really going on. And to get to the point you just brought up, with conscious experience, the notion there is that when you really think about it, this is the one thing we're sure of, is that the fact that we're asking that question suggests we're having a conscious experience, asking about our conscious experience, right? When we posit the notion of a physical world that exists outside of that conscious experience, that's an abstraction for which we have no proof, nor could we ever have proof, because of the same thing I said in the beginning. You can't extract yourself from the equation. We are part of whatever this is, right? Our, entanglement, which again, I think quantum theory only gets us partway there, but it's a helpful pointer saying that you can't ultimately separate who you are from the table you're sitting at, right? The reason why telepathy works, and precognition and things like that, and I might get a vibe about what Nathan's thinking without him telling me and without really seeing it in his facial expression, and it's because there's these porous boundaries and some of this energy can cross over, and you can actually develop that skill, that subtle skill to know what's going on with someone else. And of course, these others, this is why I use this word intermentation, they excel at that, right? It's child's play for them. So this is kind of what's on the table in terms of moving from a physicalist interpretation of any of those, right? Ultra-terrestrial, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, which again, when I say interdimensional, I kind of mean more intermentational, like, fields of mentation, mind spaces, not so much different physical universes sitting side by side kind of thing. So I use that term a bit differently. But I think getting back to what we were talking about, with what Chris Mellon's saying and all that kind of thing, one thing I wanted to point out with him that just struck me in this disclosure process as really absurd is how he's basically, I was saying, let me read a tweet that I wrote today in regards to this. I said, the fact that Chris Mellon, a former government employee, has to do the job of journalists in telling them about how elements of the military establishment are actually stonewalling on the topic of UFO/UAP disclosure says a lot about where things really stand. And what I was getting at there was, he's basically been saying lately, hey, journalists, just so you know, actually, when you say that the military establishment is making major moves towards trying to release this, he's like, nothing could be further from the truth. Like he's saying that his experience is that every inch of disclosure we get is from putting feet to the fire and not stopping. That very few of these insiders in the military establishment want to disclose this stuff. Sure, there are some individual people that do, and perhaps they're the ones that'll finally step forward with a whistleblower kind of elements that allow them to do it without being, prosecuted and without having to suffer jail time or something for violating an NDA. But the truth is, and we've talked about this before on the show, that you have this kind of institutionalized secrecy campaign, right? That's been so built into the structure of the military establishment that even if it had good reasons early on, right? Like maybe in the midst of a Cold War, when there really were a lot of double agents in the CIA, for instance, that were Soviet sympathizers, I can completely understand why they felt like you really had to, have the siloing of information, need to know, right? That made a lot of sense back then. But what begins as making sense soon is just something that is part of the culture. I gave this analogy this week to some friends. This one mother was cooking her turkey for Thanksgiving, which pains me as a vegetarian, but let's just go with it.
Mm-hmm.
So she's cooking this turkey, and she would cut off the edges of the turkey before she put it in the oven, right?
Yeah.
And so one of her kids says, "Hey, Mom, why do you cut the edges off the turkey?" And the mom goes, "Wow, I'm not sure. I guess just because that's what my mom did." So she calls up her mom and says, "Hey, Mom, why do you cut the edges off the turkey anyway?" She's like, "Well, that's because that's what my mom did." So let's call up great grandma and ask her. They call her up and says, "Why do we cut off the edges of the turkey?" And she says, "Well, because we had a small oven."
Right.
So the notion there is that, so now these modern, families have these massive ovens. They're still cutting the edges off the turkey just because that's the culture, right?
Yeah,
it's just inherited. It's not questioned. There's this sense that what's come before you, there must be good reasoning behind it, right?
Right.
And I think that's partly what we're dealing with the entrenchment in the military establishment.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's inertia there that is unavoidable. And that's true of not just of the military scenario that you referenced, but of our reality as well, right? We were born into a world that has inherited inertia from those who've come before us. And we're like swimming in that world from day one. We're navigating it. And as we're navigating it, we're finding, oh, wait a minute, like, I've discovered this other thing here that, has anyone seen this? And everyone's like, nah, actually, I've never seen that before. But it's been there the whole time. That they haven't been able to see it because they don't have that new perspective. And when you're, sort of thrust into that environment as an alien, let's put it that way, you don't see the world the way that the residents happen to see it. You see it as a foreigner, and foreigners pick up on things that residents don't see. But by pointing those things out, they change the world, right? So by recognizing that these things are there and drawing attention to them, you reshape the fabric of the world, and then that becomes a new world that those who are born into it inherit. And that process continues ad infinitum. And so with that thought, I wonder if we could take a second here to go through the thought experiment of, let's say that this takes a lot of traction in 2023, and you're having a conversation with a family member or whatever who's new to this. How long do you take between going, yeah, like it's ET, like that's pretty cool, and then saying, well, but it could also be, like, how do you kind of responsibly, and I think you have to think about it doing responsibly, how do you responsibly kind of walk them through these other scenarios of possibility, all the while saying, but I could be wrong, it could just really be ET, but it could also be this, these other things, and here is some evidence and some anecdote to consider that point in those directions that we have to grapple with. It also gets to the question of who has the core answers here, who has the best knowledge. And I think that's kind of a false assumption that many people make when approaching this topic, that there is some sort of grand, wizened record keeper in the library of UFO lore who has access to all of the grand secrets, and they have the truth. And I think that's something that is a fallacious way of thinking about this issue.
Yeah, for sure. I think part of the irony is that a lot of experiencers are waiting for public disclosure from some known authority, right? So they can feel justified and vindicated around friends and family and colleagues that maybe made fun of them or thought they had lost it. But of course, even then, a lot of their experience with the actual phenomenon will still be a far cry from what actually gets disclosed, right? So maybe there will be this discussion about, the ET possibility, maybe, but it goes a lot further than that. I think for me, and we were talking about this before we went on the air tonight, just how difficult it is for people, again, to really shift out of a physicalist paradigm, to actually say, it's just not that consciousness impacts physical reality, but that physical reality doesn't really exist, that's just a surface layer manifestation. It's consciousness in excitation, right? So the same way that you would say a whirlpool or a wave is fundamentally still water. It's just water in excitation, right? Dancing water. That's the same notion here, that everything from this field that's maintaining this sense of this granite countertop to who you are, to who I am, all of these are temporary manifestations of consciousness. And you can have a temporary localization of some sort of what looks like an object, which you can call an object or a discrete individual person, but really that's not what they are. That's just a dance of energy, really, is what's going on. So again, we see lots of hints of this already in quantum theory. And as I've talked about before, there are physicists like Nima Arkani Hamed who are doing groundbreaking work because they've recognized that even quantum theory doesn't go far enough, that, space-time is fundamentally broken. As Donald Hoffman likes to quote Hamed, he always says, space-time is doomed, right? And what he means by that is there's no way you can rescue that model. We already know enough to say that model is not tenable. It's not even just has a few holes we got to figure out, which is what most people tend to believe, right? Without real evidence, again, because like you talked about, it's just what they've inherited, right? We assume that if it's this strong, there's so much ascribing and subscription, I should say, to this model throughout our culture. We assume there must be good reason for it, right? And in some ways there are. We've talked about this, right? How science has been able to transform our civilization, right? We've been able to manipulate space-time in ways that we've transformed our lives. Tripled life expectancy, and we've got now AI systems that can do a bunch of stuff that we used to have to do ourselves before, right? And it's just beginning, right? But that's all modeling nature, right? Predicting what nature's going to do. It doesn't tell you what nature actually is underlyingly, and that's the question here. Not just what is nature underlyingly, what is the fabric of reality, but how would a different answer to that question completely change the UFO phenomenon question, and the paranormality question, and the life after death question, and the apparition question, right? In other words, all of these are connected because they are, extensions of this one question: what is the nature of reality? And I'm saying that, remarkably, we don't need government disclosure on this. All the signs are already there, that the physicalist model that tells you that there's a material world apart from your consciousness, or even worse, that your consciousness is actually a byproduct of some of the excitation of, biochemical processes, which when they break down, there's nothing to you. We know that that's not true. There's evidence now suggesting that, again, the physicalist model is completely untenable. You cannot rescue it. It's not going through a tough phase. It just cannot be rescued. And for those who are really interested in learning more about this, I'd really recommend Bernardo Kastrup and the Essentia Foundation's analytic idealism course, where he breaks this down, really helps us understand how some of what he calls our basic intuitions, or what I would say are preconceptions or strong biases about there being a physical world. He demonstrates methodically, step by step, how it's just not the case. So, I think for me, this is why this is so fascinating, because I'm interested in what's happening in the public sphere, but I'm also aware that it's really, that only gets you halfway there, right? Even if you get to the disclosure that there's other beings and they have craft that seem to be, sort of physical, but sort of not, we're not even sure what that is. And there's that, but then there's this other question which completely reframes the first one. So it's actually the deeper and more important question, which is, what is the fabric of reality?
Yeah, and I think about this too from the perspective of how this metaphysical perspective, I think, redeems the human experience. And I look around the world that I'm in now, and I see this poverty of of understanding, a poverty of our meaning making systems. Like they're kind of broken. They worked for a very long time and ordered the world, and as you pointed out earlier, like have resulted in great advancements, and have helped us make sense of who we are as a people and a civilization, and that they've done a lot of damage too in the process. Let's not get to point that out. But we are at this place, this juncture in time now, where those systems are failing. They're really failing. They're breaking, falling apart at the seams, and I think most everyone that I talk to, like, senses that, feels that deep in their core, but we don't have anything that is there to replace it, or we're certainly fumbling around in the dark, for something that may be a better substitute. And for me, this topic opens the door to that possibility, right? So that's why I look forward to this. I said this in the last episode. I look forward to these greater disclosures, because they present these opportunities for us to have conversations with the people that we care about, that I think change the way that they relate to themselves, change the way they relate to the world, like deepen and enhance all of those experiences. Instead of relegating human experience to, as you said, these little sort of chemical processes that basically at the end of the day mean nothing. We instead elevate them and say, these are meaningful. This is what consciousness does. And that's something we are all partaking in. And it is beautiful and messy and worth celebrating. And those strange things that you may have experienced, or the strange things that kind of guide you in your life, those have meaning. They're not just some kind of random, chemical lure that arises out of your gut bacteria or something like that. There's a lot of deeper meaning here at stake.
Yeah, not to mention, we are quick to ascribe all sorts of technological sophistication to these others, right? And what they're coming with is very often not a physicalist message, right? They're supposedly beyond us, many of them, and they're saying, you've lost your spiritual connection to all that is. You've believed this illusion of separation, right? You've believed that you are a finite being that is around for a few decades, and then you're out like a flame, and it never really meant anything, right? It's just a cosmic fluke that even came into existence. And they're not saying that, right? And what's interesting to me is I hear some people saying, well, they could just be tricksters, right? That might be just what they're saying to like fool us. And I'm like, well, why do you go there so quickly? Is it because it may have something to do with what I've talked about before, this integral notion that Ken Wilber really championed, this notion of the pre-trans fallacy, that when you are actually hearing someone espouse a perspective that's beyond your level of consciousness, you will misinterpret it as a lower spiral on the consciousness spiral, right? It's like a lower level because it sounds similar to you, so you just place it wherever you can, right? So when they hear, that sounds like a spiritual message, it sounds a bit like kumbaya to me, so maybe these are just, but clearly they're beyond it because they're technological. So they must be just fooling us, right? They must be trying to dupe us like a cult leader or something, right? So you see, I think people are not conscious that this is what's going on in their mind, but I think this is what's actually happening a lot of the time, is that all these steps are being made and they end up at conclusion D, when really many of those steps in between, you could call into question. Because I think we have to look at the face of it and say, okay, they certainly seem to be more sophisticated than us technologically. And that doesn't necessarily mean they are morally more advanced. But it is interesting that so often there's this corollary that they're also more spiritual in nature, or they have this kind of oneness message. They talk about being connected to us. We hear about experiencers saying that the illusion of separation can dissolve in the presence of these others. And it was kind of confusing, and I'm going to say discombobulating. That's 3 times 1 episode. That's a gold standard episode right there.
Yes.
To the point where they actually almost experience it like a kind of death, because they're like, who am I if I'm not this bundle of things I thought I was, right? If I can suddenly be something else, and still feel this sense of I amness, what does that say about the nature of reality and the nature of my own consciousness?
Mm. Yeah, and you, just to kind of take something you said there too, that hits me a lot recently, and that's how we equate in our current time, we equate technology with moral superiority, or, there are things in our world today that we have adopted, that we have latched onto as being valuable, meaningful, that signal to our society that they are worthy. And because of that, we attach to them, or whatever comes from them, let's put it that way, whatever comes from them or whatever is associated with those things, we elevate as well. And that's really a false, association. And, we really, we're in this place, I think, that pre-trans fallacy is a great example, where we just don't have the language. We're doing the best we can, and we're taking some leaps in guessing and understand our guessing and our understanding of what this may be. But all we can do is compare it to what we know. And we need to be very honest with ourselves. These comparisons are probably poor, right?
Right. And I think that also makes me think about the fact that we should be careful not to conflate the inability for us to comprehend something with an intention of deceit or hiddenness from these others, right? Sometimes we assume they're one-to-one, that, listen, you're not laying out for me nice and square, man, so I feel like there's deception going on here, right? Now, I'll be the first one to say that I think there are some in this plethora, right, myriad beings that are out there across the spectrum in terms of moral development, consciousness development. There are some that do deceive and deliberately lead astray. But sometimes it's just that it's not that they're trying to be hidden from us or make it more complicated than it could be. It's just that our notions that we're coming to the table with just can't really, they're not broad enough, deep enough to hold these realities. And so they end up looking disjointed. We've talked before, or maybe not in this show we have, but in the community, we've talked about this notion that if you had like an object that existed in multiple dimensions beyond the 3 plus time in this one, and you saw it sort of transforming into a 3D kind of object, it would look very, very strange, right? And it might actually look nothing like what it really looks like in a 6th or 7th dimensional object, right? So that kind of notion, right, that whenever you have to collapse a multidimensional object into an object with fewer dimensions, you're going to corrupt it. There's just no way you can, like literally, there's no way you can contain the same amount of information. So that's really worth thinking about here, that it's not just that they are hiding or they're not coming clean. Like a lot of people will say that, right? Like, my biggest problem is that they're not just coming forward and saying, look, this is the deal, this is where we're from, this is why we're here, right? That kind of thing. And a lot of people read into that immediately, false intentions or deceit or, something just nefarious, right? Like if you don't tell me, I'm going to question that. But of course, what we're doing there is we're basing that on our human experience, right? And we forget that we are the same evolved species. We share a field of mentation. We share an evolutionary process. Therefore, we see a lot of things in the same way. We can have this conversation. As you pointed out, even going a century or two forward in our own species would make some conversations almost impossible, right? And yet we're talking about these others who may be having a completely different experience of space-time than us, which again, space-time is only a temporary and partial construct, right? It's a construct. It's not the base reality. So this is, again, you can see how we get here all the time on this show, because these things I hear bantied about in social media and whatnot about, well, I think this because of this, and oh, look at this here. And I'm like, there's so many assumptions brought to the table about how much we feel like we know, right? So there's this adage of saying, there's things you know, things you don't know, and things you don't know that you don't know, right? Yeah. And that third category is really in play here, I think. And that's why it's interesting to me that people say sometimes, these others seem to want to change our view of reality. Now, that may be true, especially when it comes to things like, the way we're treating the earth and each other. We need some sort of evolution of consciousness to survive, maybe. But sometimes I think it's just, par for the course. We interact with these beings like you talked about. You live on the coast and you experience people coming from different cultures. You're going to be forced to deal with different conceptions of the world than someone who lives maybe in the Midwest, right? It's just, that's just the nature of the beast. So this may just be par for the course, that when we encounter these beings that are so different than us, it inevitably forces us to reckon with reality.
Mm-hmm. And let's not forget that we have a temptation as well to idolize that which exceeds us. We have a long history of that in human civilizations and societies, to put onto a pedestal those other humans or civilizations that have better technology or whatever, and say, well, this is the aspiration. This is what we should all change our lives and cargo cult ourselves into adopting. And I think that's pretty rampant in our community as well. It's this you're hanging your hopes and dreams on these others because you're looking in some ways for a savior, and I think what you're losing there is the core truth that they are on the same journey that we are on, right? That they're not. We're all a part of the same story here, and that's a fundamental truth that when you, I think, sit with it and adopt it, grasp it, like it does change everything else about how you look at this subject. Hopefully it provides you with a little bit of sort of appreciation, more solid footing for whatever this may be. And I think that's pretty important as we kind of move into these new waters ahead, because presumably, and I could be wrong, but we're gonna get some more. We're gonna get some more nuggets of truth here from whatever happens to be the case that our government knows, and it's going to be very tempting for us to kind of spin out from those things, like these fantastical hopes and dream, kind of really going to latch on to some of that, or it would be very tempting to do so. And I think we have to kind of be careful with that and really start thinking more deeply about, well, what does this really mean? And how are we connected to them and they to us? And what is this acknowledgement of this presence and this reality? What does it do for the way that we live our lives? What does it do for the way that they interact with us? And is our society, is our world ready for that new way of interaction? Because that's a huge part of this, right? I mean, as civilizations in the past, who were on the North American continent, had no exposure to European civilization, like it radically changed their world in many ways for the worse. So we're talking about something that could be as tectonically significant as that, if not more so. So huge ramifications there, and a reminder that we have to be, cautious, wise, patient, thoughtful, and not be, brash or quick to draw conclusions.
Yeah, and I was thinking in terms also of, you talked about this sense that we kind of idolize technological sophistication, and understandably so. I mean, Western civilization has fundamentally changed our relationship with reality. And so sort of de facto, we've sort of said, well, scientists, bravo, you tripled our lifespans, you gave us microwaves and cell phones. So you become the new de facto priests of the civilization. What you say goes, right? In a very similar way to the Catholic Church was in medieval times or whatever. So, but what's interesting there, and this is where, my background in integral theory again helps, because in integral theory and sort of any kind of second tier level of consciousness, What you get in second tier that you don't get in first tier is, and it's recognized as a second tier, like a completely new way, because there's one fundamental shift from the earlier stages, right? So you have this earlier group of stages that are kind of all grouped together into this one meta category of first tier. And the reason they are is because they tend to, each time they roll out, they tend to reject the previous one. They say, that was wrong. This is the way to see reality. And that holds sway for a while until it begins to develop cracks. Then it gives birth to a new worldview, stage of consciousness. And those people say, we reject the previous one. This is the way to go. And that keeps happening. When you get to second tier, what changes is there's this recognition that there's truth in each of those previous stages. Partial truth, albeit, but nevertheless truth. And that you could argue, as Ken Wilber does, that any civilization that's existed across the face of the earth over time that had a certain view of reality that they worked with for a while, there's probably some validity there, because they wouldn't have stuck with it if it didn't hold some level of representational truth to the underlying construct. And so what's interesting when you think about that is that in some ways, for like a shamanic culture, this disclosure might not be such a big deal. They'll be like, well, yeah, we deal with these beings like every night when the shaman goes out to, find out where the next harvest is going to be or whatever, or, what so-and-so should do for, where they should go live or something. Whatever family comes to the shaman and says, we'd like to know this, or, the tribe says, in the past, we need to know where the food's going to be next season. This is like a life or death situation, right? So this is not just, again, to the physicalists out there who are kind of worship our way of seeing the world. This is not just people going and, taking a bunch of ayahuasca and making some stuff up. Like, their survival as a tribe often hinged on the shaman getting real information from these otherworldly beings, right?
Right.
And so for them, they go, oh yeah, I mean, of course. I remember even Ross Coulthard talked about this, like going in, speaking with indigenous peoples in Australia, and them kind of laughing and say, yeah, you white people, you act like this is a new thing and it's such a big deal. We've been talking with these beings, since time immemorial, kind of thing. So it just goes to show that is not to say that our technological advancement isn't important and hasn't helped. It has. Again, it's a both and here, not an either or. The goal is not to just all move back to a shamanic culture. We can recognize some of the gains we've had, but also be honest about what we've lost. What in our flat landing of reality, where we focus on the surface layer, where we manipulate nature as we perceive it in the space-time construct. We've been very, very successful. But one of the casualties is we assume everything else is, reducible to subjective mush. It's not really real. And yet we have cases like in shamanic cultures where they're getting real information from supposedly these imaginary realms. So that says something about, what the future holds in terms of bringing together these different views, hopefully in something that's synergistic and maybe moves the whole thing forward.
Well, don't you think that it's going to be like a pretty protracted process, right? Because I think that I think about everything you just said there, and I think about our government, maybe pulling them kicking and screaming, in front of the podium to say whatever they know. But at that point, at that juncture, the mechanisms and the institutions of our world are going to be focused on that and apply the skills that they have to this problem, right? To this new reality. And so it's all of that stuff is physicalism. Like all of our academic institutions, all of our science, like it's just going to throw itself at this and go, okay, well, what's at the core of this, and how do we, figure out what the technology is, or all the things that that come along with that. And if that's true, I feel like we've got a long way to go, from that approach and perspective to what we're talking about here. That there's kind of a chasm in a way that it's not that it can't be crossed, but there are so many steps that must be, put in place to get from one side to the other. Do you see room here for some radical leaps in our understanding? Maybe because these systems we've talked about before, they already have these cracks. They're already kind of falling apart, already failing in describing what we're studying now. maybe those cracks just become more apparent, and then we're kind of left with no other choice but to adopt some newer models that make sense of things. But do you see room here for some significant forward momentum, and not just like, oh well, here's a panel, we're going to study this and try to figure out how we can turn this alloy that we think it's into some other thing that we can do to create a hypersonic jetliner. What do you think here?
Well, I mean, I think you're pointing at something really significant here, and that is that part of the reason why disclosure is so complex and so stutter step in terms of actually moving forward is that it's because so much is on the table. And most journalists, most politicians, Joe Public out there doesn't believe that this is a conversation about reality, right? They're like, well, I've got my religion, or maybe they're an atheist. They've determined everything's just, a biochemical soup and nothing more. And both of those groups will be confounded by this information, right? And so when you think about how many people in our society will not be really challenged by the implications here, it's a small number, right? And so I think that's really what's going on here is when people say, why are we not seeing more, pickup from the journalists of the world, right? And I think it's a valid question. That's why I brought up that comment, or what Chris Mellon's been up to. Like he's trying to do their job for them and say, don't be fooled. I mean, it's just a base level of journalistic integrity and commitment would show you that what they're telling you and what they're actually doing are two different things, right? It's a bait and switch here. And it's the oldest game in the book. And why are you falling for it? And I think part of the reason they're falling for it is because underlyingly, they don't want to really wrestle with this, nor do they think they even have to. Again, so it's that hubris again. It's that arrogance that, come on, seriously, we've got to have like 98, 99% of it down by now, right? So if ETs are in it, then surely they're just in that 1% range. We haven't quite got narrowed down. And my assumptions say, we would see signs of ships in the sky. We would see, signs of trajectories coming in from Jupiter. We're not seeing that kind of thing. So in other words, their notion of what an ET civilization would look like, an ET visitation would look like, is sort of like next level beyond our technology, right?
That's right.
But as you said, you get out a few hundred years and even human existence would look completely different. And yet that's all that a lot of journalists and politicians and the average person is willing to really conceive of here. Is like, okay, so let's picture an ET species that's like a couple hundred years ahead. They don't say that to themselves, but that's effectively what they're doing, right? And they say, look, I don't see the evidence, when you and I know that if we went back to a pre-industrial or a even older civilization, it would be very simple for us to really, really confuse them, right? Because, you put on, this week I was using this Oculus headset, right? And it was this amazing experience. And, you move around, and of course, as you move, the world that you're perceiving moves around you. So you were to do that to someone, like, you knock them out and you put an Oculus headset without them realizing, they'd wake up and they'd think they're in a different world. They would have no inkling, not even an inkling, of how to make sense of this as a virtual reality display that was manipulating their brain in such a way that, because it moves with you as you turn and things like that, that, their belief system says, this must be reality. That's just what reality does. I turn and things change in the physical world out there, right? Well, this just goes to show how much of a farce this kind of thing is, because we really are not much further ahead than those, ancestors 100, 200, 300 years ago who really felt like we had pretty much figured everything out, right? Like we've talked about this before, how there were people, in the late 19th century who really thought it's just like dotting I's and crossing T's at this point. I mean, we've pretty much got the science down, right? And then you had the quantum revolution, which ripped out everything, right? It's like, what's that famous quote, those who haven't been profoundly impacted by the revelations of quantum mechanics haven't understood it. It's as simple as that, right? Like, if you get it, you recognize, whoa, reality is not what I thought, right? Nothing like it, right? Determinism is not a thing, right? Local reality is not a thing, right? these, like you talked about, you read that one book about these guys who either became mystics because they recognized this can't be what we thought it was, or they, become suicidal or something because the things that they were so wedded to are gone, and they didn't know what to replace it with.
Yeah, it's it's kind of sad, but like it's as if we're literally looking at our universe as if we were standing on the shore of the ocean with a spyglass and scanning the horizon of the ocean and being like, well, who's going to show up? Like, if they're out there, they're going to show up on a boat and they're going to show up on this ocean, and I'll be able to see them before they get here. And I haven't seen any of them, so they're just not there, right? I mean, like, that's exactly what's happening now. And it, a part of the issue I think that you've just revealed is that the reality confronts us with how profoundly wrong we actually are. And if we really think about that, like, that's hugely destabilizing.
Right, and I think that's exactly what Jacques Vallée was getting at back in the 70s when he says that what the UFO phenomenon fundamentally teaches us is that we do not understand space-time. Now, I would go further now and say space-time is just not a thing. But even then, he was saying it, right? And I think part of the reason why he calls himself the ufologist, the only ufologist in the world who hasn't figured out what it is, he's kind of being humorous there. But he's also sort of steered clear of ufology and those circles because he recognizes so few people are willing to ask the deep questions, the big questions. What can we say about this with our current understanding of reality when we don't understand space-time? Like, how do you begin to build a model when your presuppositions have been shown to be faulty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly like you said. That's what this shows us, is that we are just not prepared to reckon with this with our current tools. And so in many ways, this is where we get really postmodern, and it's a deconstructionist movement, right? It's about saying, or in Eastern spiritual traditions, they'll define God by what he or it or she is not, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this kind of definition by negation, because the notion is, who are we as finite beings to say what the ultimate is, right? Mm-hmm. How can we do that? That's fundamentally an absurd idea. So we'll say what we know it isn't. We're pretty sure it's not, but we won't dare try and say what it is. And in many ways, that's the way we should be interacting with this phenomenon. We should be saying, at this point, we should be gathering data. And that's again, to his credit, that's what Vallée has done for decades, right? Is hold open the question. Don't prematurely commit to solutions, because the second you do, like again, using Omega Points language, what you focus on will determine what you miss, right? So try not to focus too much. Have the wide gaze, right? And the soft focus, so that you stay alert for anything that could be there that's giving you some sort of clue about what this ultimately is.
Yeah, Jacques seems to have taken stock and made the wise decision, right? Not wedding himself too strongly to a particular notion. That can be frustrating for many, because I think we really want some solid answers here. And that, that need underlies this, energy that we see in the community for the next revelation, the next, video, the next witness, whatever it is. We are operating in in a desert of information. And we've felt drops of rain. We know that there's water somewhere, but we're really thirsty, So please give us some more water so we can kind of survive here. That's kind of the feeling that I have, is that there's a desperation in many ways at work, and I understand that, right? But I think if you sit with that feeling and you think about other times in your life where you've really wanted something, right? You really felt like you had to have this thing. When you get the thing that you feel like you really, really wanted, what happens next? There's a new thing that you really, really want. There's a new thing that you really, really feel like you have to have and that you need. And your energy, and you pointed this out many times, is then that cycle occurs all over again. And and ultimately you're never satisfied, because at the core you're not fixated on the right thing. What you want is something you're never going to have. So kind of learning to get rid of that desire is, would actually be your grace here.
Yeah, and I think too, I would also point out that, just so I don't confuse people, because I think based on more recent episodes, both on this show and on Point of Convergence, they might be wondering if I'm now saying, my hands are in the air and I have no idea what this is. So I feel like I do have a strong sense of the sort of metaphysical architecture, if you will. But as you can see, as I try to roll it out, as I try to describe it, it's very, very complex, and it rips out almost every, foundational layer we have. Everything we use to prop up the floor of our existence gets pulled out, and it ends up offending or confounding almost every different kind of thinking group or belief group or system. And I'm certainly not the only one. Like, I think, again, even Bernardo Kastrup, who's put forward analytic idealism with the Essentia Foundation, he wrote a book called Meaning in Absurdity. And I talked a bit about that in my presentation in New York. And his point is that what we think of as reality, quote unquote, is not nearly as fixed as we think it is. And depending on the consciousness of different groups of people, so that you get in certain parts of the world, you'll get a slightly different rendering of reality, because either it's that group of people that impacts the field of mentation around them, right? You have this boundary where he would say you have an impingement on that boundary, right, by consciousness, and it begins to change the structure of reality around it. Because again, those are not two things. That's where people go, oh man, that sounds so new age, man, that you're saying my consciousness changes physical reality. I'm saying, no, what's more true is that those are not two things, right? And so there's just this field of interference going on all the time between these different agents that are part of, which again are ultimately the same thing, but they're temporarily excitations of consciousness taking on temporary form. And the same way that if you have two waves that cross, you get what's called an interference pattern, right? And again, we get this with the double slit experiment, this famous notions and observations that were made in quantum mechanics. But I'm saying reality is like that all the way up and all the way down, microscopic, macroscopic. And so his point, Bernardo Kastrup, was that really, and I've heard Whitley Strieber say similar things based just on his experience, that if you hear stories that are too straight-laced, like too much like an ET craft came down from Saturn, they came in, they gave me some great like geocoordinate information about like the rings of Saturn, and we talked about, the meteor belt and what's going on there, then they took off and went back, right? Because they've got a scientific expedition. That sounds all very nice and clean-cut and science fiction, right? And what we usually get is these bizarre situations where, like we talked about, Joe Simonton with the Italians landing, right? And giving him pancakes, right? Those kind of things where it confounds us, and we say that can't be real because that's just too weird. And it's weird in a way that doesn't even, it's not even like fantastically weird. It's just annoyingly weird, right? that kind of thing. And yet these are the stories. And so Bernardo's point is that he's more likely to believe a story like Joe Simonton's than Bill Smith, who says, the Saturn people landed and gave me some information about quantum mechanics so I could build a particle accelerator that's better than CERN or something like that. That's what our physicalist model wants to hear. That's why the journalists are saying, I don't think it's happening, because we're not seeing these beings bringing this kind of information. What we're getting is like these neo-humans that look like Italians bringing pancakes, right? Things like that. Or cryptids, or like we've talked before, like a 7-foot, 8-foot tall wolf being leaning against a pole, right? Or these, dino beavers and skinwalkers of the Pentagon. I'm kind of laughing here, not because I don't think those things are true, but because they are true. And I know that how that lands in our current milieu, just one doesn't fit the other. And so that just pushes back the disclosure piece, not because in that case, not because government's not bringing it forward, but people are like, that's the kind of disclosure I do not want, right?
Sure.
Number one, it's too destabilizing, but before I even get to destabilizing, it's just too unbelievable, and therefore I won't go there.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly frustrating, and I can just hear the complaints already, because our models of empirical observation, like they're not even they're not adequately prepared to understand this. We don't have the right tools, and so I mean, we just throw our hands up. Well, I mean, how do I know what is true at all? How do I get the right tools to make the evaluation? And I think that is where many are, and I am there too sometimes. I mean, we when the best tool in our toolkit is a metaphysical model that makes the most sense of it, right? Like that we're already in territory that we're uncomfortable in, because our tools look like a hammer and look like a screwdriver and look like a microscope, so you can see how we're really in a tough bind in a way. And I'm interested in however this unfolds. Like, I would like to see our civilization be affected and impacted and changed for the better, and I would like to see that happen in the most positively destabilizing way, right? So, right, I think that we have a vested interest in this being a positive change and transformation for the world, not something that is going to be catastrophic and runs on the grocery store and at the gas pump. Like this could be very, very bad. And with that being said, we talked about it many times. I mean, if that is a likely result of some of these revelations, if you're behind the desk, at the Pentagon or whatever, whoever these decision makers are, you're looking at that and going, yeah, this that we don't have the tools yet, right? You're looking at the landscape and saying the tools don't exist. And if without them, we are at the mercy of our base desires, our base behaviors. So the responsible thing is to wait until the tools are there, and then we can have this conversation.
Yeah, there's so many caveats here. There's so many factors that have held back disclosure, but we're back to that kicking the can down the road again. And that's a big part of it. It's not just that we're not sure how the public will handle this when we disclose it, but we don't even know how to describe what it is that we're disclosing, right? And anybody who has any kind of background in public relations or marketing knows that what you don't want to do is hold a conference when you don't even know what you're saying. And from the get-go that it's going to sound completely incomprehensible, and which will be interpreted as you being, just a poor communicator or just not good at your job, not serving your role well, right? So it's not going to be, we don't have the kind of culture that has space for, this person's completely competent. It's just that they're delivering information that's completely destabilizing. No, we don't have that category, right? I was also thinking about when you said, positively destabilizing, and it occurred to me another word for that might be creative, right? Like, that's, I think, what we're hoping here, right? That's the long-term goal, that this would be so destabilizing, so change-oriented to such a degree, down to a foundational level, that you would have no choice but to conceive of a different model. Because I do think deep down, when people really are, it takes a while to get there. We have all sorts of biases that prevent us from getting there. But when we finally get to that place where we go, okay, I can't deny it anymore. This is actually what the reality seems to be, right? It's pointing in this direction. There's just too much evidence. Then people will have that shift, like you talked about your shift from being kind of this more conservative religious believer to going to college to learn to specialize in it, and coming away going, actually, I'm not sure the whole thing holds up. So you changed, right? You didn't say, so therefore I'm going to spend the next few decades just believing a lie and hope that nobody, or living a lie and hope that nobody notices. No, you say, as a person of coherence who wants to be able to go to, sleep at night without feeling like you're a fraud, I'm going to change my perspective. So I think we can get there. And one hopes that when we get there en masse, that creates the kind of impetus for this creativity to really rethink how would we as a society live differently, not just because there's aliens in our midst that are interdimensional in the way that I described, intermentational, if you will, but also that life and death is not a solid line like we think. It's more like a phase shift. How would you live differently if you know that at the end of your life, you're just going to phase shift into a different kind of existence? And that goes on and on. I think it might change a lot, right? And I think we would move more towards, non-duality, because we would recognize that we don't have to have some God who's punishing us, and the eternal fire is what's necessary to get people to do good things in this lifetime out of guilt or whatever, or wanting to avoid punishment. But you recognize that, listen, we're in this for the long game. We're evolving, we're changing as part of the system and as individual manifestations, that excitation of consciousness. So if that's the case, I might as well do what's good for the whole, because that's what's ultimately good for me too, because that's what I am. Right? That's fundamentally what I am, and I now know it, not just in a conceptual way, but I feel it in my bones, and I've seen so much evidence that I can't help but shift my perspective like you did. So one hopes that's where we get to, but it's going to take some time, because that's about as change-oriented as you can possibly imagine.
Well, the encouraging thing is that the seeds are there, that the possibility space is already real, that exerts a force, almost like a teleological force on our future, that there are things in motion right now that are putting us on that trajectory of change and development. So that is the optimist, in me saying, do not be afraid, do not be anxious, because the possibility for positive development, for creative development and change, like, it is already there in the possibility space. Like, it exists. It is real. That's not to say that there won't be some moments of turmoil and pain and growth, right? We don't want to. I don't think we want to be in a world that is absent of some level of discomfort. So take courage in that it may not unfold the way that you would want it to, but there is, within this entire process of being a conscious person, conscious being, there exists within that world this sort of arrow of progression, of development, of growth, for the ultimate goal of enrichment of the entire system, of all that there is.
Yeah, and I would say hopefully people will come away from this conversation with some new ideas around why, if some of these are benevolent, as I would say they are, why are they hanging back, right? Why are they not swooping in to solve our climate process, our climate challenges, and our, unequal distribution challenges, and all that kind of thing? And the reason is because, like we've talked about before, because us growing into deeper levels of awareness that make us change our behavior, because it just becomes self-evident, is more important, right? We're looking for self-evident revelation. So they're giving all sorts of prompts to get us there, right? I made that one tweet, one of my new cosmology tweets was about that sometimes these sightings are meant to be prompts to, like, wake you up to something that some part of you already knows, right? And we should be encouraged by that, but also at the same time recognize how much is on the table, how much change exists here, at least in potentia, right? Like a completely changed way of imagining living as individuals and as a collective, right? When all these things are in play, in terms of life and death not seeming like a solid boundary anymore. And even things like individual consciousness being seen as much more malleable and temporary amongst a series, right? That maybe even go beyond, and I say coyly, maybe, I think it does, right? It goes beyond just human incarnations. So in that mind, I would say that we should take heart that this is exactly what the benevolent ones are doing. And as we talked about last time, I think that what we're seeing evidence of is a grassroots movement, where individual by individual, they're lighting that flame, setting that spark to hopefully help that person arrive at new self-evident truths for themselves.
Mm.
And then they begin to make the changes that you made when you had an awakening, right? And then when that happens on a broad enough basis, then slowly but surely the entire collective changes as well.
I think that's a great place to end it. And as we approach the end of 2023, may that change take place where you find yourself and with those that you interact with and care about. We want to thank our Liminal Frames listeners and supporters. Every comment, every tweet, every retweet, it means a great deal to us. I can't tell you how fulfilling that is to read those comments of support, and it means a great deal. So thank you so much for that, and we look forward to continuing this journey with all of you in the new year. I think it's going to be a good one. So may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery, and may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you in 2023 on Liminal Frames.